when you think about something like Black Lives Matters, that's a way of saying we belong. It's trying to make a claim on a society that has said to blacks, maybe Latinos, sometimes Native Americans, sometimes Asians, sometimes people with disabilities, sometimes people who have a sexual orientation that's not normative. Those groups are oftentimes saying, we belong. And our society, through various forms, say, no, you don't. And it says that by saying you can't get married. It says that by saying you live in a segregated community, you can't go to our school. Or it says that by saying we're going to kill you. To belong is a big issue. Without belonging, our sense of self, our sense of well-being atrophies, goes away. And that process of having people go away is what I call othering. When we claim to distance ourselves from the other. Now, at one level, that's just a false claim. So we talk about trying to connect to each other. At some level, it's unnecessary. We are connected. So really what we're doing is talking about celebrating, acknowledging, living that connection, honoring that connection. The connection's already there. We don't have to do anything to connect. We have to realize it. We have to live into it. And when we don't live into it, we have loneliness, we have sorrow, we have anxiety. We do all kinds of crazy things when we deny our connectivity. And so I talk about othering and belonging. And at one level, of course, that's also a misstatement, because there is no other. And part of it is realizing that there is no other. And yet we continue to practice as if there is. So to me, this is like the heart of what we call our spiritual practice and what we call a social justice practice. They take on different forms, but they're the same practice. They're the practice of acknowledging that we belong to each other, acknowledging that we're part of each other. And more than just acknowledging it as a verbal thing, how do we acknowledge it in terms of our space? How do we acknowledge it in terms of our songs? How do we acknowledge it in terms of our cultures? And there are all kinds of ways that we don't acknowledge it. I like to tell the story that when my daughter, who lives in the Bay Area, was a little girl, we were watching a movie, and it was one of those typically bad horror movies. And there was a monster in the closet that was doing all kinds of terrible things. Of course, the whole idea of monsters is interesting. Who are monsters? And there was a woman, the girl, getting ready to go in the closet, and as she reached for the closet door, my daughter gasped. And I said, don't worry, nothing's going to happen to her. And then the doorbell rang, and she turned away from the door, and she went to the front door, and there was a Latino young man delivering pizza. And she went in the back room to eat some pizza, and the monster came out and ate the pizza man. And my daughter said, how did you know that she wasn't going to get devoured by the monster? Have you seen this movie before? In a sense I had. This is a movie about white people. Pizza man, it's just food to be consumed by white society. But that story, right? I mean, I'm old enough, when I was a young man, I'm old enough that if there was a black character in the movie, they never got to the end. They were just there for fodder, to be the monster, to be the bad guy, and to be devoured. Those are the stories we tell, and we have to tell different stories. When we talk about connecting to each other, we talk about belonging. Let me just make this a little bit more nuanced. And part of the nuance is this. We have multiple selves. We don't have a singular self. And so part of belonging and part of connecting is connecting those multiple selves, is creating space for all of those selves to actually come forward. And those selves are diverse. Sometimes they don't even get along with each other. And so diversity in that sense is not just an external project, it's also an internal project. How do I actually give space so those different processes we call selves can come forward? Now that may sound very whatever, but there's more and more stuff coming from the mind science that can demonstrate and actually can manipulate our situation so different selves come forward. So part of this is about integrating ourselves with ourselves and integrating ourselves with ourselves outside of ourselves. It's a very important set of projects. And because we're also talking about linking what we call the social justice and political, I want to throw out a couple of other things. One is, we tend to, in political space, social space, organize along multiple axes. One axis is economic. That's a big axis, right? So we think a lot about economics, about what we have. And I sometimes remind myself and others that we're human beings, not human havings. Another axis is political. And we can make it political as a form of exercising agency and exercising collective structures. We decide to make a law, pass something about soda pops or about affordable housing. That's the political process. And in the context of social justice, we tend to focus primarily on those two, the economic and the political. The third area, and there are many more, but I'm just going to talk about one more. The third area is what I call ontological. And that's where we actually exercise who we are, our sense of being. And in some ways, I would say in this space, that is the most important axis. Who we are. Who are we collectively? Now, I've talked about spirituality and religion, and there's some thought, there's some suggestion that religions come into being to solve some deep, profound collective problem that people are having. And there have been some scholars that have gone back and looked at when Judaism came online, when Yahweh came online, when Christianity came online. What was the deep collective problem that society was facing at that time? And what we find is that there were different problems, and when you look at the expression of those religions are speaking to a specific set of problems that the people are experiencing at those times. What I take with that is to say, what is our collective problem today that we are facing? Because that should inform how we think about spirituality and religion. I gave a lecture on this at the Theological Seminary in New York. It was very well received. And at the end they said, "So what is it?" I said, "You're the seminarians." But here's my take. One is diversity. I think the diversity that the world is experiencing with millions and millions of people moving, being forced to move, society, when we initially had religions in society, they were separated by mountains, by rivers, and so we could have relative homogeneity, never really complete homogeneity, but relative homogeneity. And so we could believe our corner of the world was the world. We can't believe that anymore. So Muslims, Christians, Jews, blacks, whites, Latino, Asian, everybody's bumping into everybody. And it's actually freaking people out. And we have these strategies to try to reclaim a homogeneous space. We call some of these strategies walls. Literally, we talk about, can we build a wall? a 2,000-mile wall across the Mexican border. There are too many Mexicans coming to the United States. Every Republican candidate for president is saying, I want to build a wall. And they're not to be outdone. So Herman Cain says, I'm going to build a wall with an electric fence on top of it. I kid you not, right? Yeah. This is saying we are afraid of what's happening in the world. So I'm going to say a couple other things, and we'll stop and invite a conversation. So when we think about this wall, I sometimes talk about a circle of concern for life. A circle where no life is outside that circle. In terms of humans, we could say a circle of human concern where no group, no person, no human beings outside that circle. So I teach at Berkeley, great students at Berkeley. And when I say that to them, they say, well, Professor Powell, isn't that a contradiction? Because if you have a circle, don't you have to have something outside of it? And the answer is no. In fact, astrophysicists would say the universe is a sphere with nothing outside of it. It's a circle that's all-inclusive. And it's not only to be inside the circle and to be acknowledging human concern and life concern, but also to acknowledge our profound and deep connectivity. We are profoundly interconnected. So the last thing I want to suggest is that because of this profound connection, it builds in a radical spirituality and a radical political process. If we acknowledge and live out our deep connection, because the heart of liberalism and the heart of capitalism is a deep disconnection. In fact, I talk about 4 disconnections in our society that are killing us. Starting with denying that we are connected to God or to the universe or to whatever the greater is, we're disconnected. The second is we're disconnected from nature. Nature becomes something to be played with, an instrumentality, exploited, but we're not connected. Think about that. If we are connected, how do I exploit nature without exploiting myself? That's what's bringing us to the precipice in terms of climate change. Nature's to be exploited. The third is to be disconnected from each other. We see that happening all the time. We see that happening in Oakland right now. We still have not managed to say, okay, if we're going to have black people, white people, Latino, can they all be here really? Or are black people on their way out to someplace else where there are not so many white people? That's already happened in San Francisco. And there's a mechanism how it happened, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And the last is we're separated from ourselves. My mind and body. My body just becomes a thing that carries my mind. I become up here. This is Descartes. I think, therefore I am. So how do we reintegrate, re-acknowledge, live that out? So with all this thing in terms of the circle of human concern, the circle of life concern, where we're deep connected, where the gap between the public and private is porous, where we recognize our shared humanity. Why do we have such a hard time doing that? One is spiritual, religious, one is political. And in the political, the thing that drives it is that if you have the circle of human concern, and we start out by putting some people in the circle and some people out of the circle. Right? When we talk about the country, how the country was formed in terms of, you couldn't even migrate to the country and become naturalized unless you were white. White people are in, no, white people are out. We made a little progress on that. But here's where we are now. If you put corporations in the center of the circle, not only are black people pushed out, Latinos pushed out, all people are pushed out. life is pushed out. And that's what we're seeing right now. And I'll end with this. The new trade bill that President Obama is trying to push through, which affects 40% of the trade in the world, 40%. It makes it easy for capital, easy for corporations to move from country to country. In fact, it undermines the sovereignty of countries. It says if you do something that substantially affects the profit of a corporation, they can take you to a new tribunal. What might you do that might affect the profit of a corporation? One example they gave is to raise minimum wage. It's saying we are shifting the power from the city, from the state, from the country, to the super entity that's going to protect profit for the elite. At the same time that we're making it easier for capital to move, easier for profit to move, easier for money to move, we're saying to people, stay put. We're making it, creating super highways for capital. We're creating ghettos for people. The final thing, which is talking about how do we do this work and nourish ourselves and nourish each other. I want to come back to what Steve said earlier. It would be easy to sort of get bitter, to get angry, get overwhelmed, especially when we are exercising and practicing alone. But when we're together, in a loving space, when we're together, recognizing our connectivity, when we're together, recognizing that these are hard things, but in the midst of those hard things, there's a little kid back there having a good time. There was a beautiful sunset last night. We just heard some wonderful music. So that there's always joy and there's always sadness. And there's never a justification that makes sense to hate someone. And there's never anything wrong with loving someone. Let me stop there and introduce myself.